Three, two, one, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in a DeLorean? Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly?
Tamara, hey there.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing good, and guess what I'm not doing?
What are you not doing?
Talking about politics. Like, what's the point of having a podcast if you're not talking about politics these days, right?
We're the counter narrative. We're the
Exactly.
escapism.
Yeah, exactly. Let's
Exactly.
escape into a world of fantasy and imagination, which brings us to our topic today.
We are talking about the movie The Crow, the original 1994 movie with Brandon Lee, directed by Alex Proyas.
And which is a sad story. I discovered the movie because of the story of Brandon Lee's death. And it's interesting because right now we're dealing with another shooting on a set, right?
Yeah, I don't know if folks have been following the whole situation with the independent film Rust and Alec Baldwin and what's been
Yeah.
going on with that. So, but yeah, this was for folks who may not be familiar, who The Crow may be before your time. Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce Lee, who also died tragically at age 32. Brandon Lee in The Crow was killed when there was a gunfire mishap. And a blank went into his abdomen, and he was 28 years old. But I don't
Right.
know if it was a blank or a dummy. I'm not so on the gun play.
Yeah. Something went very wrong, and
Something
there was
went very, very wrong.
death on set. Now the story, The Crow, has to do with the idea of a familiar and the crow as a spirit, right?
Mhm.
So in the movie, you typically do our movie setups tomorrow because you're so good at it. Do you want to do this one? Because the opening narration of the show kind of tells you the whole show anyway. But
Yeah, absolutely. Although, will you do me a favor, and in your best DJ voice, will you give us your
Yeah.
spoiler alert?
Okay, everybody, if you are uncool L7 out there, I want you to hit pause right now, baby, because we're about to reveal the unrevealable, the secrets of the Crow. All right, that was horrible. You put me on the spot, man.
we're gonna do this again. Don't worry. We have
Okay,
plenty more
baby.
podcasts where you can perfect your DJ spoiler alert. It's fun
There
having
you
a
go.
co-host who's a scientist, but also has been a DJ. All right, so The Crow. So the premise of The Crow is that Brandon Lee's character, whose name is Eric Draven, he and his fiancee Shelley are murdered on Devil's Night, which is the night before Halloween, in their apartment, just as they're about to get married the next night. And a year later, he is resurrected through the powers of his familiar, a crow, to come back and seek vengeance for what he ultimately finds out was a not an accidental kind of death. There was a whole plot behind it. So the story of the film is the crow leading him to all of the people who contributed to his and Shelley's death, and him getting vengeance on that.
Yeah, you said a couple of things there that I wanted to comment on, but my mind goes so fast. I'm like on to the next one. But the first one was the use of the word familiar, which is a spirit, right? It's a spirit entity that is a companion to a person, and they can be like a guardian. They can lead you places. So if you're not familiar with the word familiar, it's a spirit of sorts. Now, go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah,
What
no,
was
all
it?
I was going to say was what's interesting about that too is that like there are different theories about familiars in different
Mm.
fantasy and different sci-fi and mythological, stories. In other words, like some folks looked at familiars as though the animal was possessed by a spirit or a fairy or an elf. So, it was an animal that was essentially possessed, and the elf or fairy was communicating through that. Some folks look at it as, some traditions look at it as like a free roaming spirit, not necessarily an elf, but that is, has gone inside the cat or whatever your familiar might be. So
Yeah,
lots
and
of
as you
different ways
called it,
to have a
the most
familiar.
common context is a witch and their cat, their black cat, right? That's the
Yeah.
most common familiar we're all familiar with. I personally don't know much about familiars. I understand it's it originates European or Celtic or something like
You know
that.
what? Honestly, there's a bunch of different
Oh, is it?
traditions across. There's a lot of different mythologies that use them. I think for the
Ah,
purpose of, or that have had them featured in stories. I think that
yeah.
for the purpose of this particular episode in this particular movie, probably the most important thing to know is that the familiar tradition that they are calling upon is that there's a direct connection between the crow and
Mm.
between Eric Draven when he
All
when he
right.
comes back and is resurrected. Like that's probably what's most important for this.
Eric Draven. And if you move that D to the side, it's Eric D. Raven.
Mhm. Mhm. And I also do feel like it's important to mention that, like, yes, the movie is called The Crow, but often
Yeah.
in mythology and fairy tales, crows and ravens, even though they are scientifically different,
Yeah.
are interchangeable.
Yeah, and I will tell you the impact that crows had on my young life. I don't know if I ever told you this, but the poet that I used to be into poetry, and my number one poet was Edgar Allan Poe. I was a dark child, and the Raven just gave me chills.
Sure.
Nevermore, quoth the
Nevermore.
Raven. Yeah, yeah. I even had the poem, and I opened my memoir with it, or closed a chapter with it, alone. Because I was always alone as a kid, but I had that
Mm.
memorized my entire life. The other one is, as a kid in the '70s, there was a
Okay.
popular movie that may have been from the '60s or the '70s that just freaked me out. The Birds. Yeah.
Classic. Hitchcock.
Yeah. Oh, it was Hitchcock. See,
Mhm.
I had even forgotten that.
Mhm.
Man, you're talking about there were two movies as a kid that freaked me out. That one, The Birds, and
Mhm.
the other one was what is that movie? The Devil's Rain.
That one I don't know. What's The Devil's Rain?
It's so corny. It is so corny. But basically, I looked at it as an adult and I was like, how was I afraid? but
Oh, okay. All right.
but there is a scene where it's raining. I don't know what the case is, but the people's faces would melt. And as a kid, that melting face just I was scared to be in the dark. I was afraid to go to sleep.
No, I got enough of that in Raiders of the Lost Ark. I don't maybe need to bring that back.
No more melting faces.
No
But
more
see, here's the
melting
thing.
faces.
As an adult now, it's the CGI was not at today's standards. Let's just put it that way. My third encounter with crows happened at age 9 when I moved to the country, and we actually had scarecrows. We were
Mm.
actually growing corn and these sort of things, right? So crows were looked at as a nuisance. So in preparation for talking about this,
Mhm.
I'm like, what can I think about scientifically about a
Yeah.
crow familiar? And the answer is obvious. It turns out that crows and ravens, right? They're this thing
Uh-huh.
called corvids, and they have these cousins, jackdaws. These are the smartest birds in the animal world, and they can even reach the intelligence level of human children, like 7 years old.
Okay, how do they know this? Hit me with the science. Tell me more.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. So basically they look at problem solving, okay, and
Mhm.
tool making. There's one type of corvids that live on an island. I forget the name of the island right now, but they regularly make a tool with a hook, right? So basically they find a plant. You have a plant and then it bridges into a Y. If you cut off one of the Ys, so it has a little tip left, and you
Yeah.
cut that off from the main stem, you end up with a little hook. Yeah, and they use that to probe in the holes to grab insects. That's in the wild. Here's what they've done in the lab. Let's start with their cousins, the jackdaw. Jackdaws appear to have, and they're all black feathered, black faces, black beaks. Jackdaws are like us, where they have a white around their eyes, so you can actually see what direction they're looking. But that's one thing about human eyes is that because we have a dark circle inside of a lighter circle, you can see where we're looking, right? Jackdaws follow human eyes.
That's creepy.
Yeah. So they do an experiment where they take a piece of food and they have a human stand there, right?
Mhm.
And look straight ahead in almost the direction of the food, but not the direction of the food. And the jackdaws will just wait, and then finally approach the food after a long time. because they're not so sure, is the human going to get me or not? But then what they do is they have the human stand in the exact same location, hold their head in the exact same direction, but then move their eyes hard away from the food, and a jackdaw just swoops in immediately and takes the food away.
Whoa.
Yeah. And the person who did that was actually, I think, the Princess of Bavaria. That was her PhD research, studying jackdaws. So it's a big story. Now,
I love that. That's awesome.
That's awesome, right? So another test they did, which is just unbelievable, that really this is where they ended up at that age of 7 years old.
Yeah.
They took these cylinders and filled it with water, not full, and had floating food, okay? And then they took one next to it that was filled with sand with a bit of food on top, and they placed like stone-like things there. And the crows could figure out that they could drop those stones in the cylinder and make the food rise to the top so they could grab it before it's out of their reach. But once they put these rocks in there and
go like that,
yeah, they can reach in and grab it. So then they did this. Instead of just giving them stones that would sink, let's give them objects that will float or sink. They knew to choose the ones that are dense and would sink rather than the ones that would float to raise the water level.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So they never would even attempt to do it with the sand. They knew it's not going to work, ignore it. But with the water, they knew that they could make the water rise. But then they did some other experiments that they didn't figure out. Like, for example, if you have a wider diameter cylinder versus a more narrow diameter cylinder, you get a bigger bang for your buck if you drop the rock in a narrow diameter one. You get a bigger rise and get the food more quickly. They didn't figure that out. And then another thing they did is they had 2 cylinders connected under the table by a tube, right? So, level in one affected the level in others, and they couldn't figure that out either. So
I don't know if I would figure that out if I couldn't see that they were connected.
Exactly, right? We call that magic. That's what,
exactly.
That's the type of thing magicians do. So another one is they gave them they put food in a case, and they had to and they provided them a wire. And they had to use the wire in order to open up the little case to get the food on the inside. The straight wire could not accomplish the task. So they learned they could problem solve in real time, having never seen this before, how to bend the wire to get the little box open so they can get the food inside.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, here's the other thing. Crows can recognize humans by their faces. They know who's familiar, who's unfamiliar. And they hold a grudge if you've ever done anything negative to them. For years, they can hold a grudge.
Wow, maybe that's why the crows in my backyard keep coming back and yelling at me. I mean, no, I've never done anything mean to them. I've just been like, go away, stop crowing in the morning.
They know what you're saying. They're like,
probably,
oh.
I mean, if they don't know the words, they certainly know by my expression, because those things are loud in the morning.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they really are. But so here's the thing. When I looked at, the cultural evolution of humans and the symbolism of crows, but another thing about crows also that I want to get to before I talk about that is how human-like they are in other ways, right? So, we humans are very special because of our brains, but we're also very special because of what we eat, right? We evolved from fruit-eating canopy dwellers that lost their forests and had to take to the ground, and food wasn't readily available. So there was this time around 900,000 years ago where we almost went extinct. And so the dental evidence shows that the humans at that time were eating a lot of like tough roots. That's all they had to survive on, or that was what was reliable. And you can see the wear on their teeth. But basically we became omnivores. We went from being specialists to you name it, we'll eat it. And so when we first started eating meat, we were scavengers, right? We were scavenging animals before we learned how to hunt them and kill them ourselves, right? So if you can eat living animals, dead animals, roots, nuts, seeds, fruits, each other, you name it, we'll eat it, right? Well, crows do the same thing. And like us, they have adapted to like every ecosystem virtually except for Antarctica, right? So, if you look at humans, orcas, crows and ants, and grass, we're the super adaptable species of macroscopic big animals and plants.
Taking all of these factors, right? The fact that they're smart, the fact that they know how to use tools, the fact that
Yeah.
they can recognize their enemies,
Yeah.
how, like, relating that back to the movie and the idea of, like,
Yeah.
does it fly then that either now or in some realm, in some future realm, there could be an animal human familiar connection? Because that's what we're talking about this episode,
Yeah.
right? Like, we're talking
Right.
about this idea, could a crow actually possess these kinds of abilities? And could humans and animals form, or crows form, this kind of connection together?
Right. Can you form a bond? So
Yeah.
listen, I don't know how to. There's a lot of things.
We've now done this enough that, like, I can see your expression and I just.
No, it's not what you think. I was thinking about chickens, right? If you raise chickens, which I did, you can form a bond with chickens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go
And
on.
here's the other thing. Go on your favorite browser or
Mhm.
video site and type in how to befriend a crow.
Okay.
There are lots of stuff about it. You can actually befriend a crow. Crows will, they'll sit and have a beer with you. They'll talk. They love NBA basketball. They'll.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like one can perhaps be friends with a crow given
Yeah.
their intelligence. Do you think, like, that you can actually form a psychic bond with a crow the way that Eric Draven does with the crow in The Crow?
Okay, so here's the thing. To form a psychic bond, you need to have this thing that mammals seems to possess, but it's hard to find in the rest of the animal kingdom. And that is
Mhm.
called a theory of mind. I recognize that you think too. So that example I gave you with the Princess of Bavaria, I think,
Mhm.
that's illustrating that perhaps they do have a theory of mind. So if these animals, these corvids and jackdaws, which are called something similar to corvid, corvialis or something,
Corbiatic.
you know how those biology people do with their words. They're so big and Greek and Latini.
Stop picking on the biologists.
A biologist, chemistry, and a physicist walked into a bar. I'm just mad because I wasn't smart enough to be a biologist. Their words are too big,
I seriously doubt that. But anyway, continue.
Of course, the whole idea of a spiritual connection is something that what is the proof? What is the evidentiary proof that something
Mhm.
like that exists? So I've had connections with people, right? What is that thing called? Some kind of twin that they talk about in some sort of astrology. Fire twins, I think, something along that
I
nature.
don't know. I mean, I know Gemini are the twins, but I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So,
I mean, there's
anyway, I just heard
complementary
about this because
signs.
someone, I did this podcast with a paranormal cat. And so in the comments, people were telling me different things about myself. And one of them was mind blowing. One of them said, "Oh, Hakeem, based on the way his mind works and everything, I bet he's Ashwini, not Ashwini something or another." It turns out that these, how our the Western astrology, which originated in Mesopotamia, Pisces, Leo, all of that lasts for about a month. These particular ones last about a day. Okay. And so you can go online, put in the time and location of your birth, and they tell you what sign you were born in. Well, it turns out I was born 7 minutes after Ashwini began. So the
Oh, that's
person nailed
freaky.
it. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. 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 Just
Okay.
like if you look up Pisces, I'm very Piscesian in my being. I'm like, okay, I know this stuff is crap, but why does it fit so well? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I can't say anything about the spiritual connection side of things. But if you want to choose an animal that is brilliant, that can, that is human like in some ways, you have very few animals to choose from, right? And a crow in the bird kingdom is the one, right? Crows, ravens, and jackdaws are the ones that do that. And then you get parrots, right, with their language skills. So even though it's not a strict, yeah, this could happen in the real world, I say it flies.
The crow flies.
The Crow flies.
The crow flies.
So the movie The Crow, listen, is this John Wick inspiration here?
I mean, look, so all right, so shifting to like the story and this idea of like, does the crow as familiar fly in the story? Let's look at two things. Like one is one is this movie's overall place in time and space, so to speak. So this is
Yeah,
1994.
yeah.
It's important to remember this was an independent film. This was done on a
Oh,
low budget. It was, Alex Proyas, the director, gritty indie, gave it, a real intense, dark feel. This was in a lot of ways like this is, and if you look at the music in the film, you've got a real like mid 90s Gen X soundtrack. It's got Nine Inch Nails, it's got Stone Temple Pilots, it's got Violent
wow. I
Femmes,
saw
Rage
Nine
Against
Inch
the
Nails in
Machine.
concert
Yeah.
in
So
91.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, so it's got like this movie definitely has like a place in time and space. Um,
Mhm.
and it's definitely been looked at as inspiration for other things. They hadn't really like done comic book movies like this before.
Mm.
I think that like keeping the context of like where it falls in the movie timeline sort of
Right,
helps
right,
you
right.
understand where it's at. I mean, the interesting
Yeah.
thing to me is like when we talk about, because on our show we don't review something in its entirety. We're looking at the specific idea of like what is the motif or what is the device or the convention, and in this case, it's crow as familiar. So if we're looking at this idea of like, does a crow as a familiar and as this like spirit guide for Eric Draven fly in this? What's interesting is like this is a pretty simple, straightforward kind of a thing, right? Like this is not a complicated movie, and for some people, for some fans, that's actually what they love about it. Like it's a vengeance story, and it's pretty consistent. It starts with a young girl named Sarah, who is, sort of our, in a lot of ways, like the audience's entree into the movie. And she's our voice into this dark and dreary version of Detroit where it's always raining. It is
Yes, yes.
always raining.
Sure it wasn't
And
Seattle.
yeah. And then there's no mountains, just buildings. And so it's always raining and like, and this idea that we learn about the murders and then
Mhm.
a year later he pops up and the crow has brought him back.
Let me interject a bit. You forgot a key element.
What did I forget?
Love. The love. It starts with love.
Yes.
Love and passion. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
another, for sure, another, yes. The reason that there is such a drive for vengeance is
Yeah.
because we do see the love between Shelley and
Yeah.
between Eric. And so that's a big piece of it. What's interesting about that, I think, and part of the reason that this like, idea of the crow is a familiar is again, it's like pretty straightforward. So you see the crow helps essentially resurrect him. When he's resurrected, he's got superpowers, he's got super strength, he's got, what I guess we would call healing factor. You see a number of times in the movie when like blades go through him or bullets go through him and he immediately heals and it totally freaks people out, understandably.
Wait, listen. I love it when he shoots through himself to get to kill the guy behind him. Like, whoa.
Seriously, right?
Yeah.
So there's lots of cool moments like that. And kudos to the director for making that happen. But the other thing that and the way that the crow functions is that the crow basically is almost like what I would call a second sight. We see a number of times in the movie when two things happen. One is that Eric is able to see what is happening in the world through the crow's eyes. Like
A
literally.
la Game of Thrones more recently.
Mhm.
The
Yeah, and that
Raven.
was
Yeah.
yeah, and that's like a perfect example of,
Yeah.
sort of this tradition of the way that crows and Game of Thrones, it's specifically a raven, the three-eyed raven, sort
Yeah.
of this idea of second sight. So
Yeah.
you've got a long tradition of that. This is, one of the major movies that contributes to that tradition.
Mm,
So you've
mhm.
got that piece of it. Um, And then you've got the idea that he's leading him to when we talk about the death, there was basically a gang of 4 who was responsible for the death, and that gang reports to I don't know if you want to call him like a mob boss or a mafia boss, played by a guy named Top Dollar, played by
Top dollar.
Top Dollar, played by Michael Wincott, who has like this crazy long black hair. And then he, is like cohabitating with what we find out is his half sister, Mika. And Mika's very into she has a mythical sense of what's going on with the crow.
Yeah.
And sort of gives insights that, it's the crow is the secret to Eric's new supernatural powers, and now he's reappeared. And the other thing I guess it's important to say is the reason for the murder is because we find out there's essentially an arson scam going on. So the gang, which is run by a guy named T-Bird. I love all these names. The gang, T-Bird's gang, is the one carrying out the arson hits for Top Dollar. And so at the end of the day, the crow is leading Eric to one by one get revenge on all the 4 folks in the gang who have done this. So when you think about how this is happening, it's pretty consistent. It's pretty simple. He resurrects, he sees things through the crow's eyes, he goes out after somebody at key moments. The crow will often participate, whether it's pecking somebody's eyes out or a distraction or whatever it might be. And it's consistent, it's straightforward. What I think kind of enriches it a little bit is, like you were talking about before, there's all this different mythology that we have to build on with crow from different traditions. And there's no one right mythology. Sometimes crows are seen as a harbinger of bad things to come or of death because of everything that you were talking about before with the way they scavenge. But in others, they're actually considered to be messengers from the gods. I mean, if you look at Greek mythology, Apollo, the crow for him was a symbol of prophecy. When I was looking up different interpretations, it looks like I want to say maybe that Norse mythology has a lot to lend here, because Odin is often represented by the raven. And there were actually usually 2 ravens that went, and I'm not going to try and say their names in their language because I'll just make a whatever. But when you translate them to English, they usually are translated as thought and memory. And if you think about the way that the crow leads Eric through this journey of revenge so that he can find peace and eventually be lain to rest back with Shelley, his lady love, thought and memory are 2 big pieces of that. And then when you talked before about this idea that crows can recognize people who do bad things and they hold a grudge. So that also makes sense for this and is consistent within that when you're talking about the story world they build. There was another experiment that I read about, which was done over a number of years up at University of Washington in Seattle, where they basically came out and they used masks. They used one that was a neutral mask and one that was a not neutral mask for bad behavior to the crows. So somebody came out, they disturbed the crows on a path, and then over the course of a number of years, they would send people out in these masks again. And not only did the original group of crows recognize the mask as somebody who was not to be liked, as an enemy, but apparently it spread amongst the population of crows.
Wow.
Right. Now, in this movie, we just have our one single crow, but clearly this crow, is very able to hold
I hope the
Eric's grudge.
politicians don't discover this. They're going to turn the crows partisan. So,
oh boy.
but something you said about the peck the eyes out, when I was reading about crows in human culture and mythology, what I saw reflected is exactly what you said, is that they were thought positively in many cases in the Japanese and places in the among the Celts. But once, so they were their wisdom, their knowledge, their memories were sort of inspirational to humans, right? And they held them in esteem. But then, you get to this era of large scale war and you have a field covered in dead bodies. They're the first to show up and they're pecking out eyeballs, which, is kind of different from the animals and the mammals that go straight for the butt or the belly, right? They go for the eyeballs,
Oh.
which was one of the things that freaked me out about the movie The Birds, because they show that scene of the guy with no eyeballs. I don't know. Yeah. And they got his eyeballs like, ah.
Right.
So the crows turn to darkness is something that came out of crow behavior, right? But if you look at crows, another thing about their adaptability is they live with us, right? They're urban. That also is pretty amazing. If you look at how many animals tend to survive in urban environments, right? I guess the best you have are roaches, rats, and crows.
Well, and that like this whole vision that they have created, which,
Yeah.
and I would be remiss if I didn't say that, that this story is for people who may be less familiar with what I'll call the Crowverse, the Crow universe.
The Crowverse.
It's initially based on comic books by James O'Barr. And then after this initial Crow movie, there were 3 more. And there's actually a new sort of
Yeah.
rebooted version of The Crow that's coming out that they're touting as like a modern reimagining of The Crow. Starring
Man,
Bill Skarsgård and FKA Twigs.
I looked at the trailer of that one,
Me too.
and it looks like it might be a bit gory.
A little bit. But well, it's interesting too, because the trailer that I looked at seems to have a lot of color in it. And a hallmark of this original 94 film is that
Yeah.
it's really dark. There's a really dark
That's right.
color palette. Exactly what you were talking about with crows being inhabitants of an urban environment. I feel like they
Yeah.
really push that. This version of
Yeah.
Detroit is dark, it's gritty, it's
It's
desperate.
Gotham.
It's like Gotham. And,
Yeah.
the camera work that you see like swooping in and among the buildings, even the way that they kind of support the idea that he's seeing through the crow's eyes, the
Right.
way they swoop
Yeah.
the cameras so you feel like
How'd they do that in 94? Did they, because it wasn't drones, right?
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a really inventive DP.
Yeah, there you
Really
go.
inventive,
Yeah.
director of
Yeah. How do you
photography and great camera operators.
Right. Oh, speaking of special effects, I looked at recently last week the opening sequence to the old kid show, The Land of the Lost.
What? Okay, our algorithm must be, because that came up on mine too.
Really?
Yeah.
No, what? I don't know
Yeah.
why,
I
but
don't
it
know.
was hilarious. The big earthquake, them going down the little stream.
I
I
know.
was like, man, as a kid, I really bought into this.
Oh yeah.
Was I a complete idiot? Like what?
No, I think these shows were really imaginative. I mean, look, like I was convinced, that I could go through the back of my closet and find, a new land of imagination. So
Yeah, and it's based on the fact that it was a more innocent world, and so in comparison to what you had seen, it wasn't out of out of the scope of what existed at the time. So I guess that's what it looked like. I remember hearing about or reading about this earlier this year about this one guy who was gonna do a scene in a movie where he gets shot. So what he did is he looked at a lot of footage of how people are, and so when he got shot on set, he did what real people do. All right. And they said it wasn't believable. Why? Because it's rare for people to actually see that. What they were familiar with was what they saw in movies and television shows. And nobody did it the way, when people acted that out, it wasn't the way it really happened. Like, think about Scarface, right? He just stands there.
Yeah. Sometimes real life is not necessarily cinematic.
It's not cinematic. So
Yeah.
when you look at The Crow in 1994, which we're talking about it like it's ancient history, but it feels like it was yesterday. It's a simple story, but it does have its rules, right? Every familiar in a story has certain rules that they go by. A story of resurrection and love and vengeance, all of that has to come together and be consistent throughout the movie. So do you find that even though it was simple, they executed it well?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think you just summed up my does it fly. Like at the end of the day, does the story of the crow as familiar leading us through this story, does it fly in the crow? And I would say, yeah, I think it's a great example of Kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. It is what it is, and they keep it consistent, and they do a good job with that. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I would say it does indeed fly. That brings us to like our third piece, which is, does it fly for the vibes? And I want to pose the idea to you. If we're looking at this idea of familiars,
Yes.
would it fly to
Mm,
actually, like, whether it's scientifically possible or not, let's just say it is, would
yeah.
it fly to have a familiar in real life? Like, is that a good idea, a bad idea, an interesting idea?
You know, that's interesting that you say that because I listened to a recent episode of the Daily Podcast
Mhm.
with the title, The Killer Robots Are Here, or something like that, right? That's a similar thing, right? These drones that we have, you can see through their eyes.
Mhm.
They're out there and then they can do bad things, right? So it's almost as if the familiars are already beside us, right? So, I see a future where you're going to have robotic dogs, you're going to have them in the water, you're going to have them in the air, and they are going to be your eyes, they're going to be your ears. And when I say gonna be, I mean because as the technology gets cheaper, it's already pretty cheap as far as like military stuff goes. Individuals are going to have this kind of stuff, right? And it doesn't have to be a living thing because robots are cheaper.
I love that my brain actually went, when I was thinking about this and thinking about talking about this episode, my brain went in a very similar yet slightly
Oh,
different direction. Like
where?
I totally went in the technology direction,
Yeah,
and this
yeah, yeah.
idea that like and it went in two different specific places. So the first one was this idea, not so much of like the robot. I started from the same place, right? That there are drones and other things which give us essentially the second sight that he has from the crow. But where my brain went was not so much the drone and the robot dog that we would share sight or insight from, but I actually went in like the brain implant Neuralink direction. So the idea of, could we, if we're talking about brain implants that give us access to senses we may not have or imagery that we may not have, so many people I know, their fantasy is, I want to be able to talk to my cat or talk to my dog or my horse.
Oh, wow.
So, is there a world at
Wow.
some point where
Wow.
eventually you have, some kind of linked brain implant where you've got it and your horse has it, or
Yeah,
your
I
lizard
don't
has it
understand. I don't
and you're
understand who your
linked?
friends are because everybody I know already talks to their pets and their animals. You
Well,
have
they
two-way.
do, but the pets don't generally answer back, or at least
Yes, they
they
do.
have to imagine that they're interpreting what they say. It's not for sure. And they're
Yeah.
certainly not like seeing through their eyes. But like, what if
Right.
you had that implant and you were actually able to do that? So that's one place that I went. And then the other place that I went was the idea that, which I guess is similar to what you were talking about, but like, if a familiar is something that expands your powers, that allows you to see other things, that is constantly like checking in and monitoring on how you're doing, that shows you where things are our phones currently our familiars? Like, are we living in this
Oh,
world already?
wow. Yeah, especially if you have one of those the people who find their bags, they put that little
Mhm.
locator in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So this Neuralink, I know what form it should come in. In the movie, it's either like plugged into your head or sit behind your
Right.
ear, right? In different movies. What you should do is remove one molar and you replace it with this device. Doop, that is
Mm.
the actual Neuralink. And it must be the color blue. And we could call it Bluetooth. You could pair with your familiar.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Too corny.
I know a guy named Elon who might be interested in that. I mean, I
Right.
don't really
Yeah.
know Elon, but
I bet. I bet. I
but
know
he
of a
did.
guy named Elon. Yeah.
But there was actually a call recently where he was talking about some of the latest developments in Neuralink, and the idea that, like you were talking about, when you see sort of these digital brain interfaces in the movies or even in real life, for the most part, there's usually some kind of external piece of it that creates the link. And his big thing that he is touting is that, like, no, it's teeny, it goes under the skin. Like, we're going to get it to the point, and may even be at the point, we're going to get it to the point where, like, even if someone was bald and you were running your hand over their head, you would not know there was anything else inside there.
Wow.
So, now, do we think this is
Yeah.
a good thing? Do we think this is not a good thing? Do we think this?
I as something that we're already doing,
Mhm.
and another problem is once others do it, you almost have to do it, right? Because now, if you look at the invention of the telescope, which is thought of as the first technology that extended human senses, imagine, when it was first commercialized, it was sold as a military device. You can see them before they see you, right? So if you find that you're not linked with some familiar and everyone else is, you're at a disadvantage. So whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing kind of falls to the wayside, because now it's something you have to do. And that's what's actually happening right now. If you look at the Ukraine war and other wars that are not, that don't, in Myanmar and places that don't get the same, in Sudan and don't get the same press in America, they're droning too, right? And they are, what we're really talking about here is software. And software is so portable, it's so easily shared, and it's gonna spread, right? This linking and being able to see through the eyes of something that is not you but is connected to you. It's already here. We
Well,
already have familiars.
and then when you add in artificial intelligence, what takes it not just from a passive ability to view
Right.
something, to extend your senses, but
Yeah.
actually starts thinking on its own, making decisions on its
Yeah.
own, depending on your definition of intelligence,
That's
suddenly you
right.
have a whole other layer of this.
That's right. And that's important, because if you look at anti-drone warfare right now, one way to defeat them is to break off the link to the operator, right? Radio jamming, as it's called. So if you're AI and you're autonomous, right, then it could be just like the crow, where sometimes you can see through my eyes and sometimes you can't. But it doesn't matter. I'm on mission. I'm staying on mission and I'm going to do my thing. Yeah. So I'm not understanding how you feel about it in the world. I feel like, I can't. When I look at the world, what is the world that I want to be?
Mhm.
And in the world that I wish existed, it will be a kinder and gentler world, right? But again, the world we live in has bad and evil that you must, if a gang of criminals knocked you off tomorrow, I would certainly come from the grave and get revenge on your behalf.
Aw, thanks, Hakeem.
That's
I
the
do this.
sweetest thing anyone's ever said.
That's so nice. So what I'm sensing is that it's not so much if the idea of familiars in our case, which we seem to both agree on this idea that, like, technology driven familiars are already here and are only gonna develop and get smarter, so to speak.
Yeah,
It's not so much a yes or no to do they fly in the world. It's it's inevitable.
it's inevitable.
Whether we think it's a good idea or not, it's inevitable.
It's already flying.
Well, thank you, as always, for helping me
Yes.
see the world through your scientific eyes.
Aw. Yes, and thank you as well. And everyone who joined us, thank you for stopping in and hearing us talk about our feathered, brilliant friends.
The crows. And if you want more Does It Fly, you can always find us on socials and online at Does It Fly Pod. Let us know what you think about the crow. Let us know if you want a familiar. Let us know what form you would like your familiar to take. Actually, maybe let's
Ooh.
end with that.
Yes.
Technology familiars aside, my final
Yeah.
question, Hakeem Oloshe, Dr. Hakeem
Yes,
Oloshe,
ma'am.
is if you could have an animal familiar,
Yes.
what animal would you like?
An orca. I'd ride that
You
sucker.
thought about this.
Yeah. Listen, I just want to be tight with an orca. And so I could ride him like Aquaman, and have a other herd of orcas with us. Think of what we could do. So what would your familiar be?
Well, mine's kind of a more sentimental answer, which is
Oh,
that I'm like, I think you know this, I'm like deathly allergic to anything that has fur. And
yeah.
I love cats so much. So if I can't like hug a cat, then I could have a familiar as a cat and at least have a cat in my life in some way, shape, or form. Because I have to believe that, like, in the spirit world, they would not make me allergic to my cat familiar.
Okay. Let's say a hairless lion.
No!
You could ride the lion. I'm riding the orca.
I don't want to ride it. I just want to have it in my life. Also, hairless
Oh.
cats are gross.
But
Well,
thank you for joining us.
thank you for being such a cool cat. Thank you everyone
Aw.
for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Wow.